Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members, for engaging in this very important discussion. As Senator Limmer has discussed, there's a lot of great provisions in this bill that I agree, and I think a lot of members in this chamber agree with. We do have to do our job to fund our court system and fund our law enforcement system, fund the functions of government. There is no law and order if there is no funding attached to those very important parts of our government and the role that we're here to do in our last days of legislative special session to complete the work of the budget. However, my colleague, Senator Latz, pointed out a lot of deficiencies, and the word that he used about what legacy we're leaving here in Minnesota, what legacy are we leaving with this bill? And members, I would say that I'm unimpressed with the legacy that we are about to vote on today. I'm unimpressed that at the moment of time where not just the world, but our own state that we're elected by, citizens and constituents and residents of our own state, asking us to do what it takes to make communities safer. And certainly, I would argue they didn't just mean fund government as we know it, but transform government. And this is the opportunity we have in this bill, or the missed opportunity that we have in this bill to do so. A lot of provisions in the Senate that should have been heard were not heard. Members of the minority were not only left out, they were shut out. Their voice didn't matter in those proceedings. And Senator Limmer, I'm disappointed in you personally as the leader for the chair of Judiciary and Public Safety that you really didn't follow the process of a chair, of what you're supposed to do. Many times we get bills that get voted down, but the courtesy that we all should give each other and the respect that we should all have for each other to bring those ideas, debate them, and if they're not the greatest ideas, they move on. If they are, you know, if a member of the Democratic Party had that idea, sometimes we see the Republicans take those ideas on and take them to the finish line, and that's okay. But it's not okay when we've had over a year, a special session after special session, when we've had 2 high-profile killings of civilians by law enforcement, and that Minnesota fails to react, fails to do what it takes to avoid those from continuing to happen, fails to see that this is a state issue. This is not necessarily a city issue, a local jurisdiction issue. I represent a district where we had one of those unfortunate incidents. When Brian Quinones, who was going through a very tough time in his life, his life was ended by law enforcement in the border of my district. And we did nothing then. We did nothing, frankly, transformative after George Floyd was killed by law enforcement. And we did nothing after Philando Castile was killed as well in St. Anthony, or Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center. These are not all metro issues. This is a state issue. And we can go on because I'm sure we have incidents in our own communities that might not have made a headline, but those lives mattered. And what I see really problematic in this bill, I'm just going to pick on one thing. And I had an amendment to take some language out of this bill. And out of respect to law enforcement and our respect of the family who was here earlier, I will not offer that amendment, but I want to talk about why it's problematic. And this is what I would tell any constituent, any law enforcement. When we are elected to do policy, and this is a budget year, but we have a huge policy provision in this bill that increases penalties. Members, increasing penalties in light of racial injustice in the criminal justice system, when we have been here before, years before, during my time in the Senate, we've actually lowered sentencing guidelines and made sure that we make amends in some areas where we know that communities of color are disproportionately affected. That is one, but not the only reason. I also am a fierce advocate for legalization of cannabis. We penalize and put people in jail and prison for minor offenses. Some of them have paid their lives with protectural stops. And the failure of members in this body, just as early as last night in finance, to not acknowledge that that is happening every day in our communities is failure to Minnesotans. And we can disagree, but to act like a problem doesn't exist doesn't make that problem go away. It just gets worse. And with all due respect, section 609.221, I've had several conversations with advocates, with legal scholars and activists, and even reading it myself. I actually worked at the public defenders, and I mentioned this before on the floor, as a law clerk. I wasn't an attorney. I was still going to law school. But one of my jobs was to read police reports and defend the indigent, which happens to be a lot of people of color in our country, because we continue to lack investments in the communities, and we see the cycle of recidivism. We know the studies that tell us what we need to do. We just fail to act. And throughout the numerous police reports that I read, a lot of them have basically the smell of pretextual, and when I say the smell, a lot of them were, we smell cannabis, therefore we're going to search and seize whatever we find, and we have probable causes to seize and search and seize the car, and then you can just see how this all ends up. A lot of kids in juvenile system, and then you see the whole cycle. It's just, it's very predictable, and we do nothing to fix that, to break that cycle. So by what we're doing with this bill today, we are increasing sentencing guidelines, sentencing mandates to up to 30 years. Members, if you recall, just, I think it was last week, we heard in the news, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I've been here too long in the last few days that I can't even keep the days straight, but we did hear that there was a sentencing that was handed down on the Chauvin case, where he got 22.5 years of sentence for doing what he did. And if you pass this bill today, we're putting a 30-year penalty on someone who hypothetically could have stopped that. If someone that was innocent bystander who was videotaping this incident and pushed the officer to save George Floyd's life, and that officer may end up hurt, you are saying that you can give that person up to 30 years under this language. And I'm not exaggerating. Read the language on page 54 and 55. And members, my father-in-law was in law enforcement. He was on lockdown when there was a shooting in the courthouse. My father was a law enforcement officer. I want them to come home safely, uninjured. If we want to do that, there's ways we can do that. But this chair, this body, this majority fails to talk about how we can do that comprehensively and holistically. We think just sending someone to prison for a longer time will solve the issue. You're just creating bigger issues. And we can go on, but we should have done this debate in committee about not just this bill, but others. And I know this bill got a hearing even in finance. And just yesterday, I expressed my concerns, and I tried to figure out how to fix it. And I can't fix it. I can't fix it on my own. I need to work with my colleagues across the aisle to fix it. And I don't want my members to vote against it to take this language off, but I can predict that this language will have to be revisited, because it's not equitable. It exacerbates the issues we have in our prison system, and it doesn't solve the issue of the violence that we have in our community, that we, as politicians, help to incite. And I think we've, again, have missed a great opportunity to fix many issues in our communities, or at least handle the dilemmas. And the deficiencies in this bill are far too great for me to support it. And it's unfortunate that members, I will be voting no for this bill, because we could have done so much better. And I could have been proud of the work that we would have done together. But this bill is not just one-sided politically, it's one-sided in terms of the people we're trying to help. We don't want more people in jail and prison. We want people to be productive citizens of our economy. Locking people up doesn't help with that. And of course, again, I want to express my deepest sympathies for all members of our law enforcement who put their life at risk every single day, even right outside of our chamber, even the sergeants that are in our retirement room. And I really acknowledge their sacrifice and the work that they do. But doing language that's not really solving the issue is something I can't do, not as a policymaker and not someone who knows that what it's going to take to fix this issue is much deeper than just a section in the bill that would actually hurt communities that we're trying to help in this moment. So members, and Senator Limmer, I really would love your response just to highlight how you think this actually would help. How 30 years in prison is a fair punishment for someone who, for instance, might be trying to be a good Samaritan and help someone like George Floyd, who was forcibly and very tragically and grotesquely killed in the streets of our great state. How do you think this bill will address that?